Welcome to Equitable Practices in Interviewing, a webinar for AmeriCorps VISTA leaders. Conscious recruiting starts with leaders becoming aware of their own unconscious biases and the potential harm that they can cause. This webinar offers some foundational information about unconscious bias and guidance on reviewing a project's screening and interviewing practices to identify and counteract bias to infuse more equitable practice in interviewing. I'm your host, Andy King, a senior training specialist at AmeriCorps VISTA. Our speakers today are from Equity Allies, a New York-based organization that provides trauma-informed workshops and consulting with the purpose of raising consciousness and agency around equitable practice, while providing tools to implement lasting culture shifts. First, Raina Erica Bonaparte is a teaching assistant, educator, community organizer, facilitator, and poet from Harlem, New York City. Raina has been involved in the arts for over 20 years and spent most of that time working at the Harlem Children's Zone, Inc. And for the past 5 years, she's been working for People's Theater Project as both a facilitator and performer. Raina is passionate about theater for social change and activism, and sees the work that Equity Allies does as crucial and necessary in order to fight global anti-Blackness and oppression everywhere. Our other presenter is Marissa Metelica. Marissa is a queer, white, anti-oppression educator, artist, and healer living on the unceded land of the Lenape people. With her background in applied theater, Marissa weaves body-centered technology into all of her justice work. Marissa is the founder of Equity Allies and a core consultant for the Racial Healing Initiative. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much. Are we ready? All right, well, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. As Andy said, my name is Raina Erica, and let's get started. Can I have them? Yes. So what will we cover today? Before we get into that, I'd like to acknowledge that we only have an hour together, so we won't be able to go over everything. But during this time, you will have a chance to chat, get in breakout groups, and also if you want to, we'll give you a chance to raise your hand and unmute yourself so you can join in on the conversation. Our hopes for today is that by the end of our time, you will understand the common manifestations of conscious and unconscious biases and their potential harmful consequences. Also, that you'll have a chance to practice identifying biases in the interview process and recommending alternative methods of communicating, as well as having strategies for understanding and uprooting our own internal biases, which we all have. So now, as our icebreaker to get us all into the space and see where we're all at to get started, we're going to ask a question in the chat, but we're going to do this a little differently, where we'll post the question and then we'll give you all a second to come up with an answer. And then when I give the countdown, we will all put it in the chat cascading. So you won't be influenced by others' ideas. We'll get to see what's available in the room where we're all starting from. So we'll start with the first question. As a job applicant, what is the least desirable part of the interview process? So I want you all to think about it, to put yourself in those shoes. As the job applicant, what is the least desirable part of the interview process? So that's the question. Thank you for throwing it in the chat. And I'm going to give everyone just a few seconds to think of their answer. And again, we're going to hold the send button until I give you the countdown. Also, if you have any questions or anything comes up, please do not hesitate to send that or to raise your hand. Okay, I don't see that there's. Okay, so let's get these in the chat in 3, 2, 1, go. It's my favorite part. They're all coming in so fast. Okay. So again, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, the least desirable part as an applicant. Just trying to see if I see any similarities. So we have being asked what your flaws and challenges are, being unprepared or anxious, multiple interviews over a long process, asking questions not related to the job. Future plan, I saw that up there twice, wondering about what's my plan in 2 to 5 years, why we should hire you, where do you see yourself, drug tests and credit checks. Okay, so knowing that the person stepping into the space is also nervous about these questions. So now I would like us to turn the hat differently. So now that we've looked at that, what about as the interviewer? We ready for that question? Marissa, I can't move it over. Can you?
No, I think if you want to layer in the question, go for it, and we will see what folks have.
Okay, just thinking about now that we thought about the applicant, now also thinking about as the interviewer, right? What do you come into the space with as well? Because the person being interviewed and the person interviewing both come in with biases, and they're nervous and trying to figure out the best way to present themselves. So I just thought it'd be important to think about that as well.
So if your response is different, would be different if you're in the position of being the interviewer, what might be the least desirable part of that process? I see. What if I say something offensive? Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. I bet that could be from both sides, right? Thinking about how you're both coming into that space as the interviewer and the interviewee. Making the applicant feel as if the company climate fits their individual, asking the right questions, seeing someone struggling and wanting to help them. Not being prepared. So already we can see that on both sides, there's this nervousness, this anxiousness of trying to be prepared, trying to present ourselves in the best way possible, and yet we don't know the other person, and yet we're trying to figure them out. When the candidate is pregnant, oh, so good. You're like sort of preparing for things that we're going to be looking at later. So already thinking about that. Wonderful. Asking the right question. Keeping the stoic face. If they ask about job salary and can't tell them the direct amount. Great. Thank you all so much for putting yourself in both shoes. Making them comfortable. Great. So now that we're in the space thinking about how we're feeling, how we're all coming into the space, we're going to step into what we enter the room with, which is our biases in every room that we step into, wherever we are. And before we jump into it, I want to define. I will start with defining what conscious bias is so that we're all on the same page and speaking in the same language. So a bias is a prejudice in favor or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. Usually it's a way considered to be unfair. So for example, boys are better athletes than girls, or these millennials have such poor work ethic, or I don't care for Black people. These are some ways in which you're consciously biased, which we all are. Let me see something in the chat. So I always want to start the conversation here with the conscious bias, and now I'm going to hand it over to Marissa to go into unconscious bias, which is a little more complicated and something that's sometimes a little harder for people to pinpoint and really say, yeah, I recognize that as something biased.
Great, thanks, Rena. So again, I'm Marissa Metellica. Pleasure to be joining you. Unconscious bias is also sometimes called implicit bias. And it operates outside of a person's awareness, and it can actually be in direct contradiction to our espoused beliefs and values. And that's why it's tricky, because we don't think that we have conscious bias, or we may not recognize that we're acting out of bias when in fact it's showing up. And so the fact is that everyone has bias. We'll talk about where we're receiving bias and how that happens in a little while, but we'll never really be entirely rid of it. So it's important that we learn that it's there so that we can begin to work with it and work through it and not let it get in the way of clouding our vision when we're making important decisions, for example. So some examples of unconscious bias are the horned or halo effect. So these are two sides of a binary, right? Where at one end, the horned effect is like attributing negative attributes to a group or a person. And the opposite of that is the halo effect, right? When we're attributing positive attributes to a group or a person. So an example of that would be Asian students are good at math, right? It sounds like a positive stereotype, but it's actually one that is limiting limiting to groups, and it can be harmful. And the next one that we're going to look at is affinity bias. So affinity bias is a preference for people who are like us. So an example would be, I can easily connect with other millennials who live in New York, right? And it's based on my experience, but it may be unconsciously limiting in some way, maybe limiting my exposure or my willingness to work with folks who are unlike me. And so it's important to be aware of. Confirmation bias is a tendency to see and reinforce the biases that I'm already carrying about groups that I like or dislike. So looking and sort of cherry picking information according to what I already believe. So an example could be, see, I know it, boomers aren't any good with tech, right? Would be a bias that I might be carrying. And I'm looking for information that's going to reinforce what I already believe. So where are we absorbing unconscious bias? From where are we absorbing unconscious bias? Well, it's definitely being reinforced by the media. The media is often portraying stereotypical beliefs about groups that we might not even consciously be connecting in their storytelling, which is why unconscious bias is a little bit tricky. We absorb a lot of bias from our family and our friends and our upbringing. Yes, I saw that in the chat. Thanks, Dawn. So the sorts of beliefs that are prevalent in our communities, you know, from spiritual and religious practices, from the schools that we're going to, from the geography of where we're from, and you know, whether we're in a city or a rural area, that's all going to impact the biases that our collective groups, our communities hold, because of the exposure that we have in those spaces. So if our communities are really homogenous, or meaning, you know, folks there share a lot of the same identities, whether that's because everybody is Christian, for example, that's also going to limit who we might have exposure to, and therefore might influence our biases. All of these things are informed by the dominant cultural stereotypes. So the messages that you're receiving consciously and unconsciously about who is trustworthy, who's dangerous, this is where, you know, it's really important to be aware of our biases and start to slow down and identify them, so that we're not making generalizations about other folks that could then cause harm, right? A common bias that we see in interviewing and hiring is that tall white men, data show, are seen as really trustworthy, and they're often given that affinity bias. And so dominant stereotypes are being reinforced all the time, and then are pervasive in, you know, throughout the media and keep reiterating themselves. And so, especially when we're in positions of power, it's important to be able to slow down and identify where these might present some pitfalls to our understanding or our perception. The most common way that bias shows up is in the form of microaggressions. And so I'd like to just review what a microaggression is. Microaggressions are statements or actions which unintentionally communicate discrimination against members of marginalized groups. And so while the word microaggression may sound insignificant, they actually can have a really large and harmful impact on the person who is receiving the microaggression. I'm going to give you some examples of what microaggressions might sound like or look like in practice. For example, you know, why do Asian people do that, right? Might be an honest attempt at making a connection with another person and learning about them. But what you unwittingly might be committing in that example is grouping several countries together, right? Let alone a racial identity, and asking one person to speak for all folks who hold that identity. And so it can be really limiting and you know, unintentionally demeaning to the person that you're trying to make a connection with. So saying things like, where are you really from, right? Or, oh, you speak English so well. These can be tricky because oftentimes they're intended as compliments, but really what they are belying is a belief underneath that I belong and you don't. And that's why they can be really harmful. Another way that microaggressions can show up behavior-wise is an example of if I, a small white woman, am standing in an elevator and a tall Black man enters the elevator and I unconsciously or unwittingly clutch my bag closer to my body, or I tense my body up, it communicates that I'm perceiving the other person as a threat, right? And so I may not be intending that, but it's actually just an autonomic nervous system response, or an unconscious response that my body is having because of my unconscious bias that I'm operating with. And so what are some of the negative impacts that unconscious bias can have? Well, those negative impacts can happen on 3 levels. They can be internal, interpersonal, meaning between people, or institutional, or at a systemic level, right? The level of systems, the level of institutions. And so internally, bias can really limit my capacity for connection and empathy because I'm prejudging others. And so I'm not allowing us to have an authentic connection or relationship. Interpersonally, bias can cause harm by denying others access to opportunities or subjecting them to unfair treatment, right? If I'm an interviewer and I'm interviewing candidates for a position and I'm not aware that my unconscious bias is at play about who I'm preferring and not preferring for a role, it can mean that someone doesn't get a job who might be really qualified. Institutionally, bias limits the self-determination of people with non-dominant identities, and it perpetuates inequitable outcomes for them that can limit the capacity of the organization or the school or whatever the institution is, right? So we all end up being harmed by unconscious bias when it isn't being checked and called out and treated with some care. I'm going to hand it back to Reina to take us through the next section about resume bias.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Yes, unconscious bias is always a little trickier because it affects us in so many ways and it's everywhere. So thank you so much for breaking that down. So I'm going to step into resume bias, and today we're going to talk about how this shows up in your world, in the interviewing and recruiting in particular. So here we're looking, there was an article published in 2017 by the Harvard Business School, and it says, we have a quote from it for it, states, companies are more than twice as likely to call minority applicants for interviews if they submit whitened resumes than candidates who reveal their race. And this discriminatory practice is just as strong for businesses that claim to value diversity than others who don't. So even when a company says we are open, everyone's welcome, this still happens. Even when people are being conscious of putting people of color, women, other discriminated people in the room, this still happens. And here what we're looking is that it happens with African Americans, it happens with Asians. We've known further on that they've done it with other races as well, but here just shows you the numbers of callbacks based on. So it's like almost 3 times as likely if you're African American, if you whiten your resume, that you will get a callback. And it's twice as likely if you're Asian. And this is putting the pressure on the person who's being interviewed to say, I'm not going to put my name or my address or a picture of myself so that people won't be able to come up, have their biases show up when they see my name, when they see my resume. So while some companies may be saying we believe in diversity recruitment, we also need to address these implicit biases in the recruiting process and interviewing process. Now that we've seen this graph and you see where the numbers stand, I would like to pose it out to you. So we're going to try again our cascading. Oh, I see something in the chat. Resume bias is something I'm worried about when transitioning. Wonderful. So already in the discussion, already things that we're thinking about. So thinking about you, we're going to do this the same way we did this before, cascading. So you have the question again, what could be done during the screening process to reduce biases? So think about that. Give you a moment. There it is in the chat. Thank you so much, Steve. So I'm going to count you down again. Just giving you a second. And then we're all going to throw it in there again to see what we have. So the question again is, what could be done during the screening process to reduce bias? In 3, 2, 1, cascade. Okay, first one we got is leave your biases at the door.
Oh, maybe we stumped them a bit.
Oh, well, and then this is great. Oh, we're getting some more stuff. So it's just taking them a second. Because it's action as we've learned, and it's also words, right? So it's a combo. So this is why it's a little more complicated, for sure. Applicants question about the candidate, what pronouns they prefer, how their name is pronounced. Yes. Removing the name from the applicant. Only look at the facts in the resume and the intro letter.
Yeah, these are good ideas. Keep them coming if you have more.
Yes. Yes, so we're seeing more focusing on the content, which is so great, focusing on what's actually on the paper. What else did we get? Just look at the qualifications. So everyone's really focused on what's on the paper. So if we were to remove the name and anything that would be identifying, we're saying that we just focus on the facts is a good way that we think we could reduce this in the process. Great. So as you've all said, these are some of our ideas as well, as I feel like they've already been stated in the chat. If we can go on to the next slide. So here are some ways, some true and tried ways that we can mitigate the process interviewing. And we want to give you some of these so that you'll consider these and hopefully take away and pass them on to other members in the future. So one of the ways that we can do that is start with a phone interview, right? Talking, you don't have to see them, you don't have anything, all you have is their voice and learning from them. And it's a good way to go about having an interview. Use consistent interview questions. If you already have a set that you know you ask everyone, then you have a way of knowing that you're getting the information that you need. You don't have to worry about asking the wrong questions, going off course. You have a script and you can stick to it. We would love it if, and we know these are true, recruiting a diverse team and defining what diversity looks like for each team. As diversity looks different, it could be maybe you're hiring, the team that you have isn't just young people or older people. Maybe it's senior people, middle management, everyone who is part of this team, and how can we highlight getting all the voices involved and thinking about diversity differently. Another great way is using a rubric. Highly recommend using a rubric. It allows you to score in the moment and providing a reason why you would score someone in that way, and understanding what that means. So if listening looks like eye contact and responding to the question, then you write that in the rubric so that you have that directly. Another way is clarifying the final decision-making protocol. So being transparent as much as possible during the interview process so that you're letting the person know, I know we're interviewing, these are the people who are going to be involved, this is the information I'm relaying, and maybe even letting the person know the information that you're hearing and relaying so that they know and they can clarify. And a big one that I finally see that we're making a big push for now is publishing pay and benefits in position posting. So transparency around pay, transparency around benefits, so that no one's time is being wasted. We all know what we're there for. People are feeling respected for their time on both sides.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick look at a rubric example.
Yeah.
And it's great if you have, even just in creating the rubric, rather than leaving it to one person, having an intergenerational, multiracial, multi-ability and disability group of folks creating the rubric together, so that it's not just one point of view or perspective that's being centered, but that actually you'll get a richer evaluation if you can use different points of view from different perspectives and different backgrounds. So
Yes.
if we look at this rubric, right, you can make a scoring on a scale from 1 to 5. And you want to identify the traits that are really important for the role for which you're interviewing. And then, maybe 1 is not demonstrating a great command of the skills, but a 5 is the highest that you can receive. You identify and you agree on the scoring. And then each interviewer would have a copy of the rubric for each person that they interview, and they'd be evaluating these and then backing all of their evaluations up with evidence. So, for example, if we're looking at technical knowledge, how do you know that the candidate communicated that they have a command of technical knowledge? Well, they wrote the code for their own website. And so that's pertinent to this role. I'm going to give them a 5. So making sure that you understand and you all are able to communicate the evidence for how you scored the way you did will help to alleviate or to mitigate some of the biases that might be present among you. All right, so next we're going to move into an activity. And there are a lot of directives here on the board, but don't on the slide, but don't worry about those just yet, because we'll give you the directions once we have finished this next portion of our activity. So we're going to move into a scenario where Raina and I are going to do a role play, meaning we're going to be in role and we're going to show you the scenario as characters. And then you're going to watch. And at the end of the scenario, you'll be put into small groups and you'll be able to discuss what you heard and respond to 2 questions, which we will give you at that time. So your job for right now is just to let us get set up for this role play. We're going to stop screen sharing and just act out a little scenario for you, for your enjoyment. So the context you need to know is that I'm going to play an interviewer named Sarah. Sarah is a 27-year-old white woman. And I'm going to be interviewing Nisha, who's a 26-year-old first-generation Indian American. And Nisha is 45 minutes into her second interview for a teaching position at a nonprofit organization that provides college readiness programs for high school students in under-resourced schools. And that is all you need to know. Okay, and one before we begin is that, thank you, Andy, for dropping this into the chat. If you would like captioning when we move to breakout groups, you can reply to Andy King directly, and so that we can support you there. All right, so we're gonna give you a little role play now.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna count us down with 3, 2, 1, action.
Great.
3, 2, 1, action. This is great. I just have one more question, Nisha. Can you tell me more about your teaching approach?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I believe in letting students be collaborators in their learning and engaging them by highlighting and developing their strengths. In other words, I like to take an asset-based approach to teaching.
Oh, that's really great. So about the position, we'll be in touch in the coming days, and the position does require some in-person work. I don't know that I saw your address on your resume. Do you live locally?
Yes, I live close by.
Oh, great. How long have you lived in New York?
Almost 16 years.
Oh, that's great. Where are you originally from?
Pennsylvania.
Oh, but you're of Indian descent, right? Happy belated Holi. I went to a Holi festival a few weeks ago, and it was really fun to see all the colors everywhere. And did you celebrate that this year?
No. My husband's family did when he was a kid, but I never have. It sounds fun though.
Oh, so you're married. Do you have any kids?
No, I don't have any children.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for meeting with me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
And scene.
Woo!
All right. So yes, I'm already seeing in the chat, folks have some thoughts about what was okay and what was not okay to ask about, yes, so this is your opportunity to have some conversation about what you saw. So we're going to, in a moment, launch some breakout groups, and you'll be in groups of 4 or 5, and you'll have 2 questions to discuss with your group. And we're asking you to take some notes via the chat for whatever comes up in your conversation, so that we have some documentation to bring back with us. And then we'll come back into the full group. And also, it's important to know that once you are put into your breakout groups, you'll have to unmute yourselves. So here are the 2 questions. Which parts of this interview could introduce bias? And how could this interview be done differently to minimize the risk of bias? So you'll have about 5 minutes to have some conversation.
So again, in your breakout groups, make sure to unmute yourself, talk about these 2 questions, and then be prepared to come back and share with us what you discussed. Thank you so much, Steve, for putting that in the chat. Please join the group when you get the message to join, and you will get a countdown when it's time to come back.
I'm really enjoying the participation.
I know. Okay, I see that people are making their way back. Welcome back, everyone. I imagine, given how great the chat was, that you all had some fruitful conversations. And for the sake of time, I would like to jump into the next slide, as we have highlighted some places where Sarah made some statements that could have possibly introduced bias during the interview. If you found any other ones, please don't hesitate to throw them in the chat. But here we have, when she asks, do you live locally? Asking her where she's from, so that already could biases about where she lives, feelings about where that could be. Does she live close by where she's originally from? Again, going back to Marissa's point about making others feel like I belong, but you don't. Implicitly says that. Happy belated Holy, not knowing whether this person celebrates that, thinking we know about people's background or what they do, who they are, making assumptions about them. Assuming that all Indian people do that. Then we also had Sarah ask Nisha if she had any kids. Again, as we also had highlighted in the chat earlier, you should not ask anyone if they're pregnant or have children, as that could lead to people wonder whether or not they'll be hired or not likely to be hired due to them having children or not, as well as it's illegal to ask a woman if she's pregnant in the interview process. So let me look in the chat. Oh, also asking if she was married. Yep. Great. So these are some potential ones that we highlight, and I also see the one about children is another one as well. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the second part of this question. What could have been done differently? How could this interview have been done differently to minimize the risk of bias? So again, as Steve has asked, you can respond here in the chat. Whoever feels comfortable speaking for their group or for themselves, or something that they heard, some ideas that could be presented, you can throw that in the chat. Okay, so here we go. The chat is blowing up. We have keep the questions relevant to the position and skill, keeping things professional and topic. We said to stick to the list. No need to improve it. That's right. If you've made a list, right, stick to it. Trust that that process is working. leave it at live locally. Yeah, additional questions about how far are necessary, right? Have a script, don't go off script. Have someone else look at the interview questions ahead of time. Yes, getting another set of eyes, wonderful. Perfect, great. So I'm gonna pass it on now to Marissa as to give us some more ways of combating biases before we wrap up.
All right, so we've given you a lot of ways that we can potentially mess up and let our biases steer us. So what can we do to make sure that our biases are not driving the boat? Well, we can accept that we and everyone else also have bias. Acceptance is key to being able to do anything about it. And just for example, right, if I ask you to imagine a pilot, there's an image that immediately pops into your brain. And this image is programmed by your own biases, right? And there's nothing that inherently wrong, it's natural, but we need to be aware that we are operating within biases, with our own biases all the time. And that, so we need to also be interrogating them, which is one of the next points, right? That we want to be active about and curious about our biases so that we can figure out what they are and make sure that they are not influencing our reactions, especially when we have positions of power, like we can offer a job to someone else. You want to make sure that you slow down. So a lot of the time bias is acting in positions where we have to make snap judgments or quick decisions. And so just allowing ourselves the time to take a breath, even just taking a deep breath, gives us a little space in our nervous system to be able to be more conscious of the reaction that we're having and give us some choice about how we want to respond. There is a website for which we will drop a link at some point called the Harvard Implicit Association Test. It's a whole series of tests online you can take for free regarding gender, regarding ability, regarding race, and you can see where your implicit associations lie. That's a useful tool if you're wondering, I don't know what my biases are. How would I find out? That's one way to be able to figure out what some of your biases are, right? And again, I just want to normalize that we are all operating with bias. And so there's no judgment. Like, we're not asking you to feel guilty about it because it's just something that is natural to human beings. We just want to make sure that we have choice about how we want to respond and make sure that those biases are not the things directing our actions and our words. So another one is seeking out exposure. And this means seeking out exposure to the groups that have identities to which you have not been exposed before necessarily. Maybe, you know, growing up, your neighborhood was all sort of the same types of folks with the same identities, and you want to seek some exposure of other groups. And we just want to make sure that we do this mindfully so that we're not doing it in a way that's exploitative of other groups or other folks, right? We want to make sure that it's in a respectful way. So an example from my life, as I volunteered at a community garden, and there are lots of folks who have immigrated from Bangladesh at the garden. And I, prior to volunteering here and growing food with my neighbors, I didn't know anybody from Bangladesh before. And so now through working together in the soil and growing things together, I've been able to make some really wonderful relationships and share some really wonderful food as well. And so practicing mindfulness, you know, this mindfulness tools are sort of a trendy at the moment, but actually recent data show that we can retrain our own nervous system responses away from the fight, flight, or freeze that we experience in moments under pressure. And that reprogramming of retraining through mindfulness practice can actually help us to respond rather than react from unconscious bias. So those are some tools that you can begin to work with your own biases. If you would like to know more about any of the topics or points of interest that we have touched on today, then there are some resources here that can help you investigate further, including that Harvard Implicit Association test platform where you can look at your own biases. And there's the first one is an article from the Harvard Business Review, and this has insights and advice specifically about recruiting. The second article is from the National Equity Project, and it looks at implicit bias in the context of structural racism. It's an infographic that really talks about how the impacts of implicit bias have not only internal, but interpersonal and systemic impacts, right, in the form of policies or laws and such things. So at this point, we have a few minutes left. We'd like to just check in and make sure that, you know, we've checked all of our bases here, that we explored conscious and unconscious bias, the ways to identify our bias, approaches to combating our own biases, as well as some equitable recruitment strategies. So we hope that you have taken some real tools. We'd like to ask you to check your understanding as well before we turn it over to Andy for our Q&A.
Great, thank you for that, Marissa, and thank you both, Marissa and Raina, for all the incredible information. And for those of you tuning in, as usual, we have this opportunity for you to check your understanding of the presentation. You'll see a poll appear and a pop-up on your screen. We ask you to use the poll to respond to this question. Which of the following interview practices could potentially introduce bias? So I'll give you a moment to read those choices and respond on your own. We'll give you a little bit of music to take you through. All right, it looks like most of you have responded, but if you haven't yet had a chance to submit your response, I ask you to go ahead and do that now. We'll give you just a couple more seconds before we close the poll. All right, we'll go ahead and close the poll here and take a look at the results. Right, so thanks for participating in that. The correct answer to this question, that is the practice that could potentially introduce bias, is B, writing a customized questions for each candidate. So remember, using the same interview questions for all candidates can help make sure that the questions are on point and that they're relevant, and they can be purposely focused on the skills and qualifications needed for the position. Doing it that way gives every candidate the same chance to share their responses, and it also helps you avoid inappropriate or illegal questions. So thanks again for participating in that. Good work. We're going to get to your questions in just a moment, but first I want to invite you to complete a short evaluation of the webinar. Your feedback will help us make these sessions the most useful they can be for you and for other leaders. The survey is probably already, actually the survey won't be open in your browser, so we have pasted the link in the chat there. Please click that SurveyMonkey link to open the feedback evaluation. All right, so now it's time to see what questions you might have for Marissa and Raina. For the Q&A session, again, we'll use the chat feature. And if you don't see the chat for some reason, if you haven't had it open, go to the bottom of your screen, move your cursor over the little chat icon, the speech bubble, and that will open it for you. So we did have one question that came in earlier, Marissa and Raina, you may have seen it. I forget now who asked it, but the question was, is it against the law to ask a person their age during an interview?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. And I just want to say we really appreciated all of the participation in the chat. It was really beautiful to see the exuberance with which folks responded. And so we're happy to have some more time now to answer any other questions that might be lingering. So yeah, just generally as a practice, as a best practice, you don't want to ask somebody about their age, right? Ageism is a real thing, and people have biases for against folks who are perceived as too young and maybe inexperienced or too old. And so we want to make sure that we're not letting those play out as we engage in the interview process. So steering away from questions about age, right? Or thinking to yourself, what is it that's what am I asking that's relevant to this job? What do I need to evaluate about this person's capacity? And generally, age is not something that should factor into that. So thinking about what the purpose of the question is, or what the heart of the question is, and then figuring out how else you could ask that question is a best practice.
So the quick answer is yes, it's illegal. It is illegal to ask. And also the only thing that you want to know is that they're eligible to work in this country, right? Like that's the only thing that really matters, that they're old enough and can work, whatever that age is.
Right, and just thank you for that, Raina and Marissa. And specifically for the AmeriCorps program, we do have a minimum age requirement of 18. So you could phrase the question, you know, are you at least 18 years of age, or will you be 18 by the time you would start this position, because that is the legal requirement for someone to serve in an AmeriCorps position. But beyond that, there is no upper age in the VISTA program or in our state national programs. So where they are on the age spectrum isn't really relevant. Now, sometimes you may want someone who has a certain amount of experience, but that's not the same as age, right? So you would want to frame your question around, you know, tell us about your experience doing this, or how long have you been involved in doing a certain type of task or activity, or, you know, how long did you hold a position, or how much experience did you have with a particular role that you may have filled. So again, as Marissa was saying, think very clearly, what is the capacity that you're looking for someone to fill the position, and then phrase your questions very pointedly to get at that capacity or that experience that you would need. So great question there. And of course, there's a whole host of interview questions that are in fact illegal, not only ill-advised, but illegal on the VISTA campus. In the sponsors area, we have a member recruitment learning path, and in there, there's a section of recruitment resources that includes a handout on interviewing, and within there is a list of things that are inappropriate to ask. So if you want to dive more and see what those might be, I would point you there to our VISTA Campus Learning site. Put out one more call for questions for Marissa and Raina, but I don't see any here in the chat. So I think we'll go ahead and move on. I do want to highlight again a feature on the VISTA campus. This one allows you to upload resources that you've created so that you can share them with your peers, other VISTA leaders in the program. You'll find this on the VISTA Connect side of the campus. In that gray menu bar, is VISTA Connect, is the Explore drop-down menu. Open the Explore menu, select Groups, and on the list of groups, select Leaders, and then look for the link to Resources. It's in that medium blue colored menu bar towards the right side. Once you click on Resources, you'll see the button to create a new resource. There's a quick little form where you enter some information about the resource, describe how it could be used, and then you can upload a Word doc, Excel worksheet, PowerPoint, lots of different file types there. Click Save. Your resource will then be queued for review by our moderator, and once it's approved, it'll appear on the site. If you go there, you'll notice there's not a lot already listed. It's a new feature, so this is your chance to be among the first to upload resources and start building a library of tools to share with your peers. And that's just one more way that the VISTA campus can support you in your service. So again, I want to say a huge thanks to our presenters today, Marissa Metellica and Raina Bonaparte, for all their expertise that they shared. And I want to thank you for your service and your participation today. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.